Heather Goodnight is an accomplished global sales and business development consultant. Over the years, her unique practical insight into problems of risk and opportunity have produced important guidance for organizations, both large and small. She is the co-founder of Centric Security Inc. and currently serves as the president. Patrick Floor has worked in information technology for 35 years. From 1986, he has worked as an independent consultant, helping customers with strategic development, analytics, risk analysis, and decision analysis. He is a co-founder of Centric Security Inc. and currently serves as Chief Technology Officer. Let's welcome Heather and Patrick.
All right, great. Are you going to hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, so fundamentals matter. A brief introduction to risk analysis for information security. We have been doing this presentation for about 6 years, but today we changed it up. So this is the first time we've modified it. We're going to modify it in the way that we're still going to touch on the basic concepts of risk and opportunity and probability and possibility and uncertainty and variability and all kinds of the different concepts that you use in risk analysis because they're important. Definitions are always important when we're talking about these things. When I started as a lowly salesperson I was actually asked to go ahead and do some studies on a brief risk analysis. I was actually sent this book right here. So 890 pages was my introduction to a brief introduction. So it is a rather comprehensive, obviously, topic. And we want to also encourage everyone to keep this interactive because, you know, risk analysis in corporate or in education or any other area of your life, which we do on a daily basis, also sometimes called decision analysis, can be used in very simple matters, like, and we'll get into that, or they can be used in very big projects. So risk analysis obviously is a very big important topic, and especially in information security. So moving on to who we are. So we got a nice introduction. I want to talk a little bit. So we founded Centric Security back in 2009. We wrote a course called Information Security or Quantitative Methodologies for Information Security Professionals. That course is about 8 hours, and what it does is it teaches information security professionals how to quantify information security into dollars and speak the language of finance so they can then practice that and then communicate that to the organization's C-level executives, right? Well, that was great. We had so many people, big Fortune 500 customers. Some of them are here today. Thank you for being in the audience. It does help a little bit with my nerves. And we were very, very encouraged. And we even had customers of mine that allowed us to come in, big Fortune 5 customers of ours, allowed us to come in and do quantitative assessments within their organizations. And these type of assessments were very big, and we did them in parallel with other like big 3 firms that were doing qualitative assessments. We found out very, very quickly that our quantitative methods, although everybody liked them, they did not, they did not, when those dollars were actually in black and white, it created a lot of pain. They rather wanted to see the green, yellow, red buckets. Even though you come up with a number to stick in those buckets, that didn't want to see $40 million of risk versus, $90 million of risk. They didn't like that. So we found out that although there's still value in doing these analyses, we still have people that do want to learn them, but we don't have a lot of people, even though there's a lot of believers. And we can talk about places like ISSA, which Patrick will talk about, some, factions in our industry adopting these type of practices. They ultimately end up putting them into qualitative types of products. So in many of our GRC products, for instance, end up into qualitative type of dashboards. So we moved on. You switched to the...
Have we talked about the agenda yet?
You moved on to... Yes.
I moved on too soon?
No, go back. There you go. So we actually founded a second company this year called Cyber Breach Response. This was actually formed in response to our work with companies and lawyers and cybersecurity insurance firms. So I know that we mentioned some of our credentials before, but one thing that Patrick's going to talk about today is our work that we've done for net diligence. And I don't know if you're familiar with net diligence, but we're going to talk about that today. We have been very involved with cybersecurity, insurance claims, how those things get paid after breaches, and those are some of the things we're going to get into later. So as we go through the fundamentals today, we're actually going to sprinkle in real live examples. And I think that will hopefully help a dialogue, although y'all seem so far away. So I'm really, maybe I'll walk back there and make you, like with a microphone or something, talk or whatever. But, cyber breach response, we are in, and I think you've seen a shift, or maybe you've heard of a shift, of coming in and talking to companies about defining what their actual risk might be if they were breached. What does that number look like if they were breached today? And then what mitigation do we put into place, into action, so that we're ready, we're prepared? And that's not actually done out of the InfoSec office. It's actually usually done out of the GC office, CFO, Chief Risk Officers. That's really where we've seen people adopt it. We've seen law firms bring us under their wings to do those types of activities because lawyers really understand that concept. So we're seeing that in more and more. So I wanted just to mention that. You can see some of the credentials. They're not all there, but just to give you an idea of who we are. And then
let me just jump in with one thing. This is kind of an aside, but is there anybody in the room who's a member of the Society of Information Risk Analysts, CIRA? Okay. So I'm not going to say much about it. I printed out some flyers. It's a nonprofit. It's really most of the thought leaders in information security risk are to be found on the discussion list. I just took a spot as Director of Education. Part of the reason I'm here today. If you want to know more, get one of these after the presentation. Sorry, Heather.
No, that's okay. Move to the next one. Okay. So what is risk? So back in 2007, there was an article, front page, I think the Harvard Business Review had a big splash, and it said, what is risk? And it was all about information security risk. Can you define it? Can you quantify it? Can you trade it? All of these types of things. Can you really trade information security risk? It was a very fascinating article at the time. And at the time, I was actually working mainly with financial institutions out of New York City. So I held a dinner, and I had 30 CISOs in the room, and all of them very distinguished, even very distinguished to this day. And the first question I asked them is, how do you define risk? And the whole room erupted, right? You wouldn't have believed it. Everybody defines risk differently. So when I ask you what is risk, everybody would have a different definition of risk most likely. And that's really important. I think that's a big thing that people overlook. Your version of risk within your organization is very different than most likely the people in other parts of your organization, right? Marketing views risk very differently than security operations, for instance, right? You may think that, oh my goodness, the unpatched internet-facing Windows, that's a big risk, right? But marketing may not see it that way. And so dollars get shifted within organizations because most of the time, nobody's speaking the same language. And so that's a big thing for us. So that often leads to what we call this risk landscape, this giant state of confusion. A real live example of that would be back during the financial collapse, if you guys remember that. Financial companies were doing what? They were siloed, right? Each business had their own, company, right? Own downline, and each company was being managed, and they're managing their own risk, right? Within those silos. But nobody was aggregating that risk at the top. So what happened? They assumed way too much risk. Another example of that is there was a company called Keen, and it was a long time ago, and we see this a lot in mergers and acquisitions too, where companies say, and you guys can relate to this, I think it's a very big topic, and there's plenty of vendors out there that want to talk to you about this, cloud security, right? Sales and marketing or sales may put something up, or this company side over here, they don't believe it's a risk to put this over here in this kind of application, and et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden you have all these applications and all these things up in the cloud, and you're not following, and nobody knows, and who has privileges, right? That's all. This risk is always, and how do you get your arms around it, right? But even other parts of the business are making risk-based decisions that could put your business entirely out of business. And this one example, this company Keen, they took a company, and instead of doing their due diligence and making this company a subsidiary, they took the company and they just folded it in. Well, lo and behold, this company had a massive amount of asbestos issues. I mean, and Keen was an $8 billion company. Well, guess what? They went out of business. The lawsuits on the asbestos stuff was way more. So completely outside of InfoSec. But your business, it could be because of decisions made, not relative to your world, right? Because of risk-based decisions. So that's just something, when we talk about state of confusion, another example of what's going on within your whole organization. How can you be a part of that? How can you understand the simple fundamentals so that you're able to then communicate those up to your senior management or your other parts of the organization so that they can aggregate the full risk of the company and make sure that they're managing it correctly. So I learned this mainly through my my teachings from Patrick. I remember early on in InfoSec, and this was probably back in 96, 98, and before I really, all the way up through 2007, before I actually was schooled. We used to go and, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Oh my God, the sky's falling, right? Or we'd say, well, this product is going to give you a return on your investment. Really? What security product gives you a return on your investment? Anyone? I mean, that's an oxymoron, right? So I actually kind of felt stupid when I finally realized what that meant. But what I did start doing is I did learn a very simple equation. And it really kind of helps me a lot, especially it really makes me not really a salesperson. It kind of helps me to figure things out. It's a concept that many of my customers really appreciate. And I'll just point out one, estimated monetary value. So when I sat down with a customer, and I had a customer who really wanted this new product, right? Really wanted a different product, but their CISO happened to sit on the board of this other product that they already had. But this other product did not do what the security operations team needed to do. And the amount of time that they were spending trying to do things it was ridiculous. But this product that they had was free, right? So how do you overcome free, right? Your CISO sits on the board, your product is free, you want to buy another product, and by the way, it's expensive. Even though they've discounted it, because they still got to make money to stay in business, and we got to be fair about that. But how do you do that? Well, we did do it. We did it through estimated monetary value. We did it. We documented what the security operations team was spending. We made it defensible so that the numbers were defensible, and we went and we presented it. And guess what? they bought the other product. So free is not always free. And it's a great tool. It's one of many tools that we have. But guess what? These tools are not new. I mean, it's kind of one of those, I was like, okay, we feel really stupid. But all of these tools exist. These are old tools, and Patrick's going to speak to them. I mean, the insurance market has been using so many of these things. The finance world has been using so many of these things. If the people in information security can adopt this language and understand it, they're able to communicate better, and they're not just beating themselves, their head against the wall. So with that, I turn it over to.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me just ask a question. So ROI, I'll assume most of you know what that is or means. IRR, anybody in the room know what the internal rate of return is? Okay, good. How about EPS? Okay, must be a finance guy. Yeah, you're this guy here. The rest of us are that guy on our knees, maybe. So I just wanted to kind of point out that, you know, every world has its language. The language of business is really finance. It's money, and that's how we really got started in doing all this stuff, trying to bridge the gap. I have kind of a hybrid background. I'm really a classical scholar by training. Ended up in information technology in 1980, and I guess did a stint in evidence-based medicine where the statistics come from, and been doing risk and risk analysis and information security the last 6, 7, 8 years. So I want to talk about risk and the risk landscape initially, and I'm going to start off by saying a few words about what risk isn't. So risk is not vulnerabilities, even though oftentimes people, including me, use the word risk to describe what's actually a vulnerability. They'll talk about the risk of an unpatched system. Well, it's not that unpatched systems don't have risks, but the unpatchedness is the vulnerability, and the resulting potential impact or loss exposure is the risk. So I think it's important that we think clearly about our words and what they mean. So a threat is not a risk. So there may be people in this audience who are carrying concealed handguns. My question for you would be, do those handguns represent a risk? Yes? No? Do they represent a threat? Okay, no to what and yes to what? All right, maybe it's too hard to do in a crowd this big. I would suggest to you that the gun represents a threat. Whether it represents a credible threat depends on some other factors. If you study military doctrine at all, or if you're a former soldier of some sort, you know that for a threat to be credible, it has to have at least 3 qualities. It has to be capable, which a gun certainly is. It has to be there has to be motivation of the threat actor, and there has to be opportunity. And if any of those 3 things are missing, then the threat is really not credible.
The comment was because they're in school.
Oh,
On school.
Oh, I see, because they're on a school. Okay. It goes to show what I know. It's been 45 years since I've been in school, so some things have changed. My point is, you know, there is a risk involved with someone with a handgun, but it's not the gun. It's the result of if that gun would be used against the person and result in an injury. So the injury, the impact would be the risk. And I think a lot of people get a little bit confused about that, so I want to belabor the point a bit. There's one other important element of the risk landscape that I didn't put on here, which is controls, obviously. So in the analogy of the gun and the threat and the risk, a bulletproof vest would be a control of some sort. So I think you get the picture. I'm not going to beat you up over it. So that's what risk isn't. So what is risk within the context that we're talking about? Well, I have a feeling that most of you have seen the ALE formula, annualized loss expectancy equals single loss expectancy times annual rate of occurrence. That formula actually comes out of actuarial science. As a formula, as mathematics, it's absolutely valid and simple to understand. The problem is coming up with credible numbers to plug in, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the point is, risk has a frequency component, how often, how likely is it to happen, and risk has an impact component. How much is it going to cost if it does happen? Or let's say if you're the military, how much is your mission impaired because of something that happened, or a nonprofit? So usually risk is measured either in dollars or in what I would call impairment of your ability to conduct your mission, whatever that mission may be. And we'll come back to this formula in a minute. There's another formula that you may have seen, something to the effect that risk equals controls times vulnerabilities times threats. It goes something like that. As mathematics, it's pure nonsense. It's kind of like saying, a margarita equals salt times tequila times whatever else you put in one. It's not a mathematical relationship, but there is a relationship, so it at least captures that part of things. So getting straight on what risk is and isn't, I think, is important as you approach work in information security. I'm going to talk a bit about scales of measurement. This part of the original presentation was 13 or 14 slides long. Didn't feel like at 4 o'clock that was going to play too well, so we cut it down to a couple. Scales of measurement basically fall into two essential groups. You've got qualitative and you've got quantitative. There are volumes and volumes written in the social sciences about different types of qualitative scales and what you can and can't do. Here's some examples. So you have categorical or nominal scales where you name things. Boy, girl, yes, no, that kind of stuff. You've all seen them. You have ordinal scales where there's some directionality to the ratings, first, second, third, or on a scale of 0 to 5. I'm sure you all have seen that. Capability maturity models, for example, usually run on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 meaning ad hoc, 5 being defined in the context. And you have interval scales, like the Fahrenheit scale for temperature. And the reason I'm talking about all this is that it's very frequently the case in the published literature, in the discussion, in materials from vendors, that people do inappropriate arithmetic on qualitative scales. You take something like a Likert scale on a scale of 0 to 5, you really can't average those numbers legitimately. If you stop and think, how can we be sure the difference between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4 is the same? Or how can we be sure that two different individuals are going to interpret the instructions the same way? You can't. You can count them up, you can take proportions of total, but you really can't average them, do statistics, do standard deviations. And a lot of people do, and I'm still scratching my head about that. I just don't get why they do that, but they do. So quantitative or ratio scales, well, these are what we call numbers, real numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. So by definition, the distance between the numbers 1 and 2 is the same as the difference between the numbers 1,000,000 and 1,000,001. This is the whole basis that arithmetic and mathematics is possible. So just when you see a scale on 0 to 5, or you see an average maturity of 3.3, maybe you'll think about that guy that gave a talk at 4 o'clock one afternoon in Plano, Texas, and said you really shouldn't be doing that. Another area that we find people confuse are the difference between possibility and probability. This is really a huge one. It's all about context. It's all about the meaning of threats. Not only are they possible, but how probable are they? So let's do an example. This is a big coin. It's got two sides. What is possible with this coin? Well, I could define one side as heads and one as tails, and I could toss it up, and it would most of the time land on one side or the other, right? I could throw it at somebody. Is that possible? Yeah. I could toss it up in the air and it could roll underneath the stage and fall down an air conditioning duct. I'd never see it again. That's possible. It's also possible I could throw it and it would land just so and stand on its edge. Okay, so what am I really talking about? I'm talking about the fact that possibility is simply something that can happen. Okay? It doesn't imply anything at all about how likely it is to happen, whether the odds are 50-50 or anything else. It's just something that can happen. Okay? So the possibility is basically an outcome. Could I eat this coin? Probably not. If it were chocolate, it would be a different situation. Okay. So how is that different from probability? Well, probability involves what we call trials. So flipping this coin 100 times and seeing how it comes up. It involves a calculation. So let's say we want to know if we flip it 100 times, how many times does it come up heads? It may be 50, but probably it will be a little bit either side of 50. It could be that distribution that you see, the graph. There are ways to simulate 100,000 flips of a coin, and all sorts of probabilities of coming up heads or tails are possible. Some are much more likely than others. So the important thing is probability involves a test of some sort. It involves a numerator and a denominator, and it will always be a number between 0 and 1. If somebody ever tells you, well, there's a 130% probability of rain tomorrow, somebody's not talking straight. That's a nonsense statement. Quantitative risk analysis is all about probability. And we'll see about that in a minute. Okay, lastly, or almost lastly, people sometimes get confused about the difference between precision and accuracy. I believe it was John South this morning in his keynote made a comment about trying to be too precise in an answer when an accurate answer would have been good enough. We have to understand in risk analysis, in many things in life, there's not a single correct number, or if there is, we're never going to know what it is. We're always going to have some uncertainty around where we think an answer is. Oftentimes we will. And so precision is impossible much of the time. So for example, if I said to you, given the security posture of this company that we've assessed, I think they're going to get breached exactly 1.3 times every 2.5 years. You'd probably go, that's the kind of nonsense that is why we quit listening to people like you. If I told you, a range of, say, 1 to 3 times, in the next 2 to 3 years, if I put some uncertainty in there, more accurate, less precise. The important thing really about all of this is, and I'm going to come to that in a sec, is it really just depends on the decision you have at hand. If you're talking about allocating $50 million to a budget, that will probably warrant some pretty serious financial analysis, probabilistic estimates, and all sorts of stuff. If you're talking about, should we buy a Keurig machine or some other kind of machine for the coffee room, maybe you ask one or two questions and you just call it a day. So it's also always important to remember the context in which you're talking about possible, probable, accurate, and precise. Before we get into the use cases, I want to make one more comment, and I have some pretty strong biases here, so I'll warn you in advance. So you look at this picture, can anybody make a guess how I look at good data and bad data? Pardon? Exactly the same, right. Data are just data. Pretty much the same way I look at big data and small data. When I was working in medicine, we did evidence-based guidelines in urology, so stuff like prostate cancer, kidney stones, that sort of thing. And we went to the National Library of Medicine, and we would pull abstracts for maybe 10 or 20,000 articles pertaining to the disease and the patient of interest that we were studying. That in my book counts as big data. It's a little bit different than, say, the big data like you get off a SIM or out of logs. But, big data has a lot of connotations. My point is data are just data, and they basically are fit for purpose, purpose being decision at hand. And I think that's really important. For some decisions, you don't need much data at all. You don't need quantitative probabilistic analysis. You can just ask one or two questions, and you either turn left or turn right, and you're done, and you don't look back. For other decisions, as I said, it can be much more complicated. So I want to talk a little bit about data breaches, and I want to paint a little background for you. This is really what got me started in information security coming out of medicine. I came across some information that talked about something called an exposure of data at a company called TJX. This was back in late 2007. Okay? Something like either 45 or 90 million records got stolen. I think probably everybody knows the basic story that the bad guys set up in a van in the parking lot of a TJ Maxx, and they had a Wi-Fi sniffer going, and TJX was running WEP encryption, which is not too hard to crack. And before long, they had figured it out, and they were in the network of that store, and it was like 1 or 2 years before anybody figured out what was going on. Now, there's a guy named Alberto Gonzalez, interesting story in and of itself. He was like a double agent. He was an FBI informant after he got convicted the first time, but then he still ran his gang. And then he got busted again. He's in jail right now. So there was that. And then I came across this thing called per record cost. And I thought that was interesting, and something called the Ponemon Institute. And $200 per record lost. And I thought, okay, well, I'm fairly quick with numbers. So let's take 90 million records times $200 a record. That's $18 billion. And I found myself saying, I don't think so. I mean, I just don't believe that. And I still don't believe it. And of course, it turned out not to be true in their case. Of course, there was some Gartner analyst saying, oh, it's going to cost TJ billions of dollars. Well, if you follow the story in their SEC filings, does anybody here study data breaches or have an interest in that topic? Our finance guy left. I guess I put him to sleep. But publicly traded companies have to file certain documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission every so often. And TJX actually did a fairly comprehensive job of documenting their breach costs. Now, it's not all that straightforward, just if you start doing it. Sometimes you have to follow these things for 3 or 4 years because they're making estimates, they're settling lawsuits, they're making estimates about what they're going to do with the PCI Council. So the numbers keep moving around, but at the end of the day, it looks like TJX spent somewhere between 170 and $200 million dealing with their data breach. And then the rumor on the street is they had to accelerate about $250 million of CapEx and spend that money a couple of years before they were really planning to. So that was a cost that you really never saw on their balance sheet. So I don't think anybody would say $450 million roughly on a data breach is pocket change. Maybe Donald Trump would, I don't know. But I certainly wouldn't. The Target breach, you know, it looks like it's going to come in sort of in that range. But anyway, if we're going to talk about the costs of data breaches, I guess the first thing we need to settle on is, what do we mean? What is a data breach? So I've put kind of a composite definition up here. Many of you may be aware that there are, I think, 47 or 48 individual state statutes in the United States dealing with the subject of data breach, plus there are federal regulations, HIPAA, most people I'm sure will have heard of. Everybody knows about PCI probably, which I've just mentioned. PCI is not a regulation. PCI is not a law in the sense that HIPAA and some of the others are. PCI is a contractual obligation. And I think a lot of people don't understand the difference. If you have to comply with PCI, it's because somewhere you signed something in a contract, either directly or by inclusion, that you said you would. You know, the United States Congress didn't pass a law and say you have to do PCI. It's a contract between consenting parties. All right, so a data breach involves the unauthorized exposure of data that you never intended to be exposed in that way, is the closest paraphrase. A data breach is a security incident, no question about it. But not every security incident, obviously, is a data breach. And the report from Verizon, called the DBIR, does a nice job of delineating and defining those two things. But I think my point is, everybody's talking about data breaches, and I think it would be helpful if we all meant sort of the same thing by what we were saying. Otherwise, what are we saying? I don't know. There are all kinds of data breaches. It's important to recognize that. You can see some of them listed here. They have different attributes, different ways the costs scale up depending upon size. HIPAA breaches, for example, oftentimes involve a very small number of records, like 2, 3, 4, 5 records, but they might involve fines in the couple hundred thousands of dollars. You know, certainly enough to wipe out a small medical practice just over 1 or 2 egregious exposures. Other breaches you've heard about, like Target, Heartland Payment Systems, TJX, we're talking tens and hundreds of millions of credit card records. So when you talk about a data breach and you want to think about how to do a quantitative analysis of risk for a client who might potentially experience a breach, you need to build your use case appropriately. One size absolutely does not fit all. So I want to come back to risk and frequency and impacts. Oh, thank you. You want me to, did I go the wrong way? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, for example, if you're old enough to remember phone books, where your name and telephone number and often your address was printed and distributed to everybody, unless you paid extra to be unlisted, you know, certain types of information are considered to be not protected. Your name, first and last name, your phone number, your email address. And so the statutory definitions usually don't include just that. They usually throw in something like a driver's license number, a medical records number, a social security number, a credit card number. But I think we all understand that these big powerhouses like Google and Apple and Microsoft and IBM and who knows who else are collecting such vast amounts of data on all of us that maybe they have two records. So we'll take me, for example. You know, we know, they know my name. They know I have a fondness for cowboy boots. Maybe they don't know who bought this particular pair of boots, but by inference and correlation and other stuff, they can figure out it was me. And next thing I know, in my browser, I'm getting an ad for cowboy boots. Well, it's, you know, maybe it's a minor invasion of privacy, maybe not, but I think you get the point that this last one, correlated data, I think in the next 5 or 10 years, we will see the statutes beginning to address this as protected data. And just something to be on the lookout for. And Heather, thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so risk equals frequency times impact of sorts. And if you don't know what these two graphics are called, they're called histograms. If you have a digital camera, you probably are used to histograms for light and dark pixels, RGB, that sort of stuff. So I want to talk a little bit first about the frequency component that feeds into a risk calculation. Frequency is certainly the most difficult thing to model. I start off there talking about a paper from something called the Workshop on the Economics of Information Security, WISE. It's an academic gathering. It was in Belgium this summer. I wasn't able to go. I've been the previous 2 years. This paper by Edwards et al. Was voted the best paper of the conference. And their assertions are basically, if you look at the Identity Theft Resource Center data, and you apply appropriate, somewhat sophisticated statistical analysis, you come to the conclusion that the number of breaches and the rate at which they occur over the last 10 years and the number of records involved really hasn't changed all that much. So that was kind of a surprising finding that I'm not saying believe it. I'm saying that these guys are scientists. They did a thorough job. They set up their, assumptions, materials, and methods, and that's one of the conclusions they came to. Now, I have issues with that. I can see some people here, kind of scratching their heads going, maybe I better take a look at that and see what I think. And if there's one message I want to impart above all else today, it's that thing about critical thinking. Don't believe it because I said it, because Heather said it, because John South said it, because the CEO of Microsoft said it. Believe it because you think it's true. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. The time, okay, I'm going a little slowly, but we're getting there. Ponemon Institute, and disclaimer, Larry Ponemon and I are actually friends. And our friendship started over a disagreement about $200 per record. I sent an email to info@Ponemon blind about 5 years ago saying, I just have a real problem with this. I just don't think it makes any sense. I mean, I was civil, and I'm a nice guy, and I believe in, civil discourse. So my phone rings 4 hours later. I'm not kidding you. This is absolutely true. My phone rings, and this guy says, Patrick, my name is Larry Ponemon. You sent me an email. And we had an amazing discussion for about an hour. He invited me to become a member of the Responsible Information Management Council and come to Santa Fe in a couple of weeks. The way he put it was, he said, what are you doing in 3 weeks? You want to come to Santa Fe? I said, well, what's up? And so, so I went. And then 2 years later, he appointed me to be a fellow of his institute. So I have a certain fondness for this man. He's a wonderful man if you don't know him, but that doesn't mean I agree with everything he publishes or even most of what he publishes. So he did publish a study that pertains to frequency. It's this 5th annual benchmark study. And a benchmark study in the Ponemon world is not just ask the first guy you see. They conduct 5, 10, 15 interviews in each company of people at all levels, and they combine the responses. So it's a pretty serious research effort. It costs a lot of money. So they found 40% of the organizations that they talked to in this study had had more than 5 breaches in a 2-year period. Now, these were healthcare organizations. So that's a frequency number. I mean, we're looking for data points, so I'm looking wherever I can. Last thing I want to say that really complicates frequency, you often hear people say, well, look, it's just impossible to do that because the adversary is intelligent. And it's very true that the adversary is not only intelligent, but very intelligent and not constrained by laws or rules or morals that maybe most of or all of us in this room are constrained by. So I think it really depends. If it's an opportunistic attack like a script kiddie or somebody firing off a script in the morning and just probing like 1,000 IP addresses, coming back at the end of the day to see what looks interesting, you might be able to do some interesting things with frequency about that. If it's a targeted attack, sorry, it's yes or no. You're either targeted or not. If you're targeted, then sorry, you're hosed. They're going to breach you. I mean, other people do a better job than I of the stories of the bad guys who spend a year or two modeling their victims and getting in their network, but it happens, and I think many of the people in this room know that. Accidental exposures, I guess didn't really lead to a data breach, but we all know that accidents happen in information technology. People trip over power cords. People apply rules to firewalls without testing them, and lo and behold, the whole thing crashes. And if you just happen to be unlucky at that moment when the bad guys are knocking on the door, so those kinds of things might be able to do some things with frequency. Okay, there's an impact element. And I'm going to talk about it separately. Here are some sources. People talk about impacts on a per record basis, and that's a discussion we could argue all afternoon about that. Where it's appropriate, where it's not, is it right, is it wrong? I'm not going to go there yet. I mean, I'm just not. All you can really say is that there's a fairly weak, if you look at the data, which I've studied, is as you would expect that as there are more records, the per record cost usually comes down. And as there are more records, the breach tends to cost more. But it's not a straight line, and nobody has really figured out how to model it properly, not the guys at Verizon this year. I'm going to say something about them else in a minute. So another thing to consider is, and most people don't, is whose costs are you talking about in a data breach? Usually we mean the company or entity that got breached, but I'm going to go out, sit on a panel with some insurers next week. Those guys don't really care what the breach costs the company that they insured. They care how big the claim is. I mean, we've all dealt with insurers. They may be really sympathetic, but when the rubber hits the road, what they're interested in is their bottom line. How much is this going to cost me? These are just a number of the kind of costs that are involved in a data breach borne by the different parties. And then lastly, which costs? Direct and indirect is probably the easiest way to characterize this stuff. So direct costs, like you ought to know what you paid Mandiant or Verizon or Trustwave. You ought to have invoices. If you contracted for credit monitoring, you should know what that cost you. So there are costs in a data breach where you ought to be able to be very precise about what they were. And I'll just add a footnote. I assume most of you have heard about the breach at the Office of Personnel Management in the United States government. So I don't know if you heard that they actually wrote an identity theft monitoring contract with some folks, and they are going to pay them $132 million over 3 years. And that's to cover $22 million. So the stuff that you and I might end up paying $100 a year for credit monitoring and stuff, basically works out to $2 a year per person in the OPM breach. So that's, there are apparently some discounts and economies of scale to be had there. Okay, indirect costs are brand damage, customer churn, stock valuation. These are really, really difficult to talk about in a meaningful way because sometimes the stock recovers, usually it does. Sometimes it doesn't, the company goes out of business, that's less frequent. This is really where my big issue with Larry Ponemon is really trying to understand these soft costs. So I would encourage you, if you ever have to project the cost of a breach to your organization, to consider that. Okay, I think I can wrap this up pretty quickly. Here are some sources that I look at. Oh, when we were putting this together, Heather said, well, you know, how would people besides you know where to look if they were interested in this? So here's a report from Net Diligence. It came out 2 days ago. I happen to have a bit of an inside track here. I've done the data analysis for these folks the last 3 years. So, I mean, I knew it was coming out on Wednesday. I got a copy on Tuesday. This report analyzes insurance payouts. Okay? An insurance claim payout is not necessarily the same thing as the cost of a breach. And I've been having a pretty violent argument with my friends at Verizon DBIR about this, because they analyzed this data, and they started off by calling it claims data, and lo and behold, it somehow magically became a better way to do the cost of a breach, which it is not, in my view. So think about insurance. It's got deductibles, it's got limits, sub-limits. If you've ever filed a medical claim, depending upon your insurance, you know that your cost, the insurer's cost, I mean, it's just very complicated how this stuff all works out. So the best you can say about insurance claims data, and the insurers are very interested in this, is that it represents kind of a lower bound for the cost of a data breach. You know, if the insurance company paid $1 million, that the breach cost at least $1 million. It may have cost $30 million because stuff was not covered. The company might have had self-insurance. You know, so for example, Target had $100 million in coverage, but you know, everything else they're basically either writing off as expense or self-insuring. So they're going to be out probably net $100 million or so. So net diligence is an important study to be aware of. Here are the 3 most famous Ponemon Institute studies that deal with the cost of breach. And I think the important thing there is that pretty consistently over the last 10 years, the average cost of a breach is about 2/3 soft, 1/3 hard. Customer churn, brand damage, estimates, that sort of thing represents usually 2/3 of the cost reported. And that's, a lot of people have trouble with that, including me. The cost of cybercrime report, which the woman at 2 o'clock, I believe she was citing that, looks at it a little different. It only looks at breaches that were the result of crime, and it looks at the total cost over a period of 2 years, which may represent 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 breaches. So the interesting thing I thought here was 59 companies, but 544 interviews. So this is not just sign up on Mechanical Turk on Amazon and get a $10 gift card for providing the answers. This is serious survey work. Now, you know, we'd love to have randomized control trials and other kinds of things, but we don't. Almost everything that anybody has is a survey, or else a very biased, selected, small subset of data. Okay, finally, the 5th annual benchmark on medical, which I cited before. Last thing we come to is the Verizon DBIR report, which is a great forensics report. But if you stop and think about it, most forensics investigators are going to be long gone before the costs start rolling in. I know from having studied this for a number of years that the costs keep rolling in, changing over a period of 4 or 5 years on a big breach. So the forensic, and they tell you the same thing at Verizon or TrustWave or any of the big forensics houses, they're gone to the next gig before anybody really knows how much it costs. So Verizon contracted with Net Diligence, the same people that I work for their data set, and they did an analysis, and as I said, that I may be the only person on the planet besides them who can say this because I know the data. Their assertion that the claims data equals data breach data is false, period. It couldn't possibly. There are reasons I can talk about, reasons I cannot because of non-disclosure. And then this nonsense about 58 cents per record that you may have heard of. I don't even know where to start on that. But anyway, I ignore that one section of the DBIR. I think the threat analysis, the forensics, the rest of the stuff, that is very, very interesting. So anyhow, I think we are coming to the last slide, which is you take these things, you combine them using probabilistic methods, which I've actually got a little model on my laptop if anybody wants to see it after the talk about some ways you could do this. And I ran a little over. Well, it's not quite 5. So thank you, first of all. Go ahead. That's because you're glad it's over, right?
Right,
You can go home.
It's Friday and it's gorgeous outside. Go ahead.
I've heard that some companies, maybe I've heard this wrong, but have actually broken even or made money on breaches that until their insurance companies get wise to it. Like the Sony, you know the numbers, but Sony, they had that dog in a movie that maybe 10 people would have seen. That they got all that free publicity after that breach. I mean, what do you think about this?
The answer to your question from my point of view is yes.
Yes, that's true. I mean, you take the TJX breach and you actually, like Patrick said, follow it in the SEC and then 10K, and you start looking at what the money that they put aside, right, to pay out. You start following it over the years. Now contrast that with their stock. No press is good press. All press is good press. What happened to their stock? What was the other one? Home Depot.
Target. You look at Target stock a year later, it was up 35%.
Home Depot went up. I mean, it's.
So my basic assessment statement would be, yes, I know of examples like that. That's one. There's some others I know about. But the most important takeaway, I think, is it depends.
Right.
There have been companies that went out of business because of a breach. And usually smaller ones. Target, is it going out of business? I don't think so.
I think a great one, and I don't know if John South's not here, but I don't think he's here. John, are you here? Because I can't see you if you're here. I think Heartland Payment Systems is one of the best examples of actually turning a situation into a profitable situation. So Chris Heron, who was the CISO at the time of the breach, he was on the job for actually 2 weeks when they were breached the first time, and then they were breached again. They were using, and y'all may have more information, but I'm going to paraphrase kind of, but they were using a third-party device, right? And so what Chris did is he moved over into the CTO role, and John moved into the CISO role. And what he did was he overhauled and started manufacturing their own device. And then that device became something that they could sell. So that in that case, they actually became profitable. So taking something, and that is, we deal with companies all the time, and we talk about risk analysis, and one thing we really didn't talk about is opportunity analysis. So the opposite of risk analysis is opportunity analysis. Can actually a risk be an opportunity? Of course, I'm always looking at, anytime you can turn information security into opportunity for the business, right? There you go. Of course, that's where I live and breathe. And we do that kind of work as well. Yes?
So I realize
I don't even want to go there.
Ah, no,
Okay, here's what I'll say. I was actually retained by a New York law firm to be a consulting expert. I think that's what they called me because they didn't want me to be discoverable by the other side. So there are all these legal nuances that I didn't know about. And it basically involved the estimation of legitimate reimbursable costs in a very big, well-publicized breach that had occurred. And it looked to me like the reasonable per record number for the bit they were arguing about. So what you have to understand about insurance on a big breach is there's usually more than one carrier involved. Are there any insurance people in the room by chance? So you've got a primary, and then you might have one or two or three secondaries. You know, nobody's willing to carry all $100 million, all $200 million of the cyber risk. And that's the fundamental problem with what Verizon did with the net diligence numbers. They did not distinguish that. But my point is, it looked to me like a reasonable number in that context was about $10 to $20 per record for what they were arguing about. Now, I never was told how they finally settled it, so I'm just speculating, okay? But, you know, there are some breaches that cost on a per record basis $30, $40, $100,000 because somebody exposed Michael Jackson's medical history, and the regulators took a very dim view of that.
Yeah, well, and I will say this too. Two things I think are kind of interesting. I have so many customers that when the PCI regs dropped, that said, okay, let's sit down. Let's look at the forklift upgrade cost of being in compliance. And let's sit down at the table with the PCI regulators and let's talk. Okay, so you're going to fine me $25,000 a day for not being in compliance. Okay, well, it's going to cost me, because I'm blah, 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 Fortune, blah, 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 globally, and I transact this amount of money. So, okay, I'll just pay you. Now let's talk about something that just happened yesterday. Chip and pin, right? How many of you are in retail that have point of sale devices that have to forklift your point of sale devices to take chip and pin now? Anyone? Because how many of you have a debit card that has a chip and pin? Yeah. Have you had the unfortunate experience at establishment to try to check out with that yet? And the poor sap on the other side has no idea how you slide it, have to put it in because the software, oh my gosh. So their workaround now is, okay, so think about it. What all point of sale devices now have to be in compliance with that? ATMs? Gas stations? Right? It's not just point of sale devices in actual, right? Stores and things like that, right? We are talking, and where does the liability now and the cost now reside? Anyone? Effective yesterday, you're correct, but really, who incurs the cost? You're exactly right. Who gets that? Exactly. We're going to pay for it. We are going to pay for it. And do you really think that, just conceive the number of ATMs, conceive the number of gas stations that are out there. Yep. Absolutely.
Well, that's interesting because one of my kids lives in Dubai and they have chip and pin there, and my American Express card works. Now, all my credit cards work, but what I have to do is sign instead of punch in a pin. So they've made some progress, but
Yeah. But I'm wondering, I actually have a client that makes so much money internationally from point of sale transactions, and they refuse because they're internationally based, even though they do a big business in the U.S. They say, PCI, I won't say what they actually say because I can't pronounce it, and it's a very difficult language. But they're actually, so they say no, and so you know what they did? They went to their processor, the bank, right? And they say, you pay our fees. Because you make this much money margin from us, from all these transactions, we don't want to, so yeah, gotta go. But yeah, so I think the chip and pin thing is gonna happen in the same manner, so anyway.
well, we're way over. Thank
Thank
you.
y'all.
We could sit here and talk all day.